All right, testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. You hear that? Double check. Testing 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. You heard that? This is on the next mic over. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 1, 2. Testing. Testing 1, 2, 3. This is witness right. Witness right.
The title of today's task force hearing is Stopping Terror Finance, a Coordinated Government Effort. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the task force at any time, and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. Without objection, members of the full committee who are not members of the task force may participate in today's hearing for the purpose of making an opening statement and questioning the witnesses. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to thank everyone for joining us at this hearing of the House Financial Services Committee Task Force to Investigate Terrorism Financing. I'd like to again thank Chairman Hensarling and Ranking Member Waters, as well as my colleagues here for their consistent and unwavering support as we continue to investigate the threat of terror finance. During our term, this body has attended investigative hearings with policy experts and briefings by administrative personnel to better understand how terrorist organizations finance their activities around the world. In addition to investigating the evolution of illicit finance flows, we continue to review the rules and the regulations of the United States government that we have in place in order to determine whether they're effective or whether those rules require modifications or whether modifications are necessary. We know the United States is central to understanding and combating the funding of terror. The Treasury's June 2015 National Terrorist Financing Risk Assessment, which was the first of its kind, clearly stated that the central role of the U.S. financial system within the international financial system and the sheer volume and diversity of international financial transactions that in some way pass through U.S. financial institutions expose the U.S. financial system to terrorist financing risks that other financial systems may not face. This task force continues to note that illicit actors are adaptive, constantly evolving their money laundering and financing techniques to better avoid detection. These techniques and practices, such as trade-based money laundering or the narcotics trade, often cross the jurisdictions of several different U.S. government agencies, making communication, coordination, and information sharing amongst agency personnel paramount. These findings have pushed us toward a common conclusion. In order to properly combat the financing of terrorism, government coordination is a necessity. Yet, unbelievably, the federal government does not maintain a single strategic document or interagency implementation plan for combating the financing of terrorism. Today's hearing will focus on federal efforts to combat terrorism financing and explore how the U.S. Department of the Treasury coordinates with relevant agency and law enforcement personnel to fill this current gap. At this time, I'd like to recognize this task force's ranking member and my colleague, Mr. Lynch from Massachusetts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to Vice Chairman Pittenger. I really appreciate you holding this hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses today, Director Calvery and Deputy Assistant Secretary McDonald, for helping this committee with its work. And thank you for your good work every day. I am pleased that we're holding this hearing so we can examine how to best coordinate a strategy within the Treasury Department and across government agencies to stop the flow of financing to terrorist organizations. Detecting and disrupting the flow of funding to terrorist groups is crucial in our fight against terrorism. While it has proven to be challenging work, I also think it is extremely worthwhile. In March of last year, House Financial Services Committee Jeb Hensarling and Maxine Waters, our ranking member of the full committee, created a 21-member bipartisan task force and charged it with ensuring that our government is using every tool at its disposal to deprive groups like the Islamic State and Boko Haram and other terrorist organizations of the funds they rely on to advance their destructive ideology. Through this task force, we've learned that we must mentor and support financial intelligence units in vulnerable countries that lack the rule of law. Some of my colleagues on this task force, both sides of the aisle, have recently returned from a congressional delegation to Latin America to examine these issues. My own work in this field, along with many other members on this committee, has been focused on the Middle East, where I've had the opportunity to work on some ongoing counterterrorism financing efforts. In particular, we've been actively involved in establishing financial intelligence units in Jordan, Afghanistan, and in Morocco. These FIUs have served as national centers that promote information sharing by receiving, investigating, and sharing financial intelligence with law enforcement agencies and international financial intelligence counterparts across the globe. Given this focus on strengthening FIUs, I'm pleased to learn more about the Treasury Department Office of Technical Assistance collaboration to strengthen FIUs in Guatemala and in Cambodia. As we're all aware, countries with weak financial institutions and ineffective financial sector oversight serve as a breeding ground for terrorist activity. They seek to raise and move funds without detection, and witnesses at our previous hearings have emphasized how the U.S. could play a more productive role in addressing these risks by providing technical assistance to countries that fail to implement adequate anti-money laundering and counterterrorism financing measures. This can be accomplished by thorough, robust, dedicated teams of Treasury attachés and contract advisors that are posted in relevant countries, that are high-risk countries. During a recent CODEL, Congressional Delegation Donnelly, Joe Donnelly over in the U.S. Senate, we visited Bahrain, Iraq, and the UAE, and I had the opportunity to meet with Bill Rich, one of our young Treasury attachés. He's one of only 17. I was very impressed with Mr. Rich and the good work he's doing in this field, but although he's a very bright and capable person, he's responsible for a very wide portfolio with many countries that cover many challenges, and a portfolio that I believe is too robust for one single person to properly manage. They need help. All of our attachés need help, and we need more of them. In order to effectively combat terrorist financing threats both in the U.S. and abroad, it's imperative that the U.S. implements a cohesive strategy to determine the roles and responsibilities of Department of Treasury attachés and contract advisors. We've got to deploy these people more effectively, and they need more resources, and as I said, we need more of them. My colleagues and I in Congress have an important role here, too. Through the appropriation process, we have to support the vital work the Treasury Department and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and other relevant agencies engage in to safeguard our financial system from illicit activity. I have to look forward to the hearing, this hearing, and from hearing from our witnesses today so we can better understand the U.S. government effort to combat illicit finance. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. I now recognize for an opening statement the Vice Chairman of the Task Force, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Fitzpatrick, Ranking Member Lynch, and to our distinguished panelists, Ms. Shasky, Calvery, and Mr. McDonald, for your presence with us today. In my opinion, both panelists represent the most significant government agencies dedicated towards combating money laundering and illicit finance initiatives, and we thank you for your continued hard work. Through this task force, I've had the opportunity to travel and learn about both U.S. and foreign responses to terror financing. Recently, we traveled to Colombia, Panama, Paraguay, and Argentina to meet firsthand with many South American officials, FIUs, and others tasked with combating money laundering and drug smuggling. With the utmost confidence, I can say that every official we met with had a genuine interest in promoting anti-money laundering and smuggling initiatives. However, each official also echoed the financial and technological hurdles in place that prevents a foreign government from living up to their own capabilities and to FATF enforcement standards. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the Office of Technical Assistance provide critical capacities to track terrorism financing while improving financial institution infrastructures around the world. However, I truly believe that we can do much more in certain areas around the world to educate and assist with anti-money laundering capabilities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our distinguished panelists. I look forward to hearing from you, and I yield back.
Now recognize the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Sinema, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Fitzpatrick and Ranking Member Lynch. The Islamic State is a serious threat to the United States and our allies. While coalition forces have succeeded in recapturing some IS-controlled territory, IS maintains a global network capable of funding and carrying out deadly attacks on civilians here and around the world. This task force has received testimony that the internal sale of oil is a significant source of income for IS, but it's the taxation, extortion, and theft throughout the entire supply chain that funds the organization. As IS continues to diversify its revenue streams, we must have up-to-date information and a coordinated strategy to disrupt its funding sources and keep money and resources out of its control. This is why Chairman Fitzpatrick and I offered an amendment to the NDAA to direct the Secretary of Defense to establish a whole-of-government strategy to destroy their funding networks. This strategy must include a comprehensive assessment of IS's revenue sources, evaluation of best practices to combat IS financing, and clear ways to measure the effectiveness of efforts to weaken IS. DoD must also specifically address how it will deny IS revenue from the sale of Libyan oil. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to keep money out of terrorists' hands and build on our progress to strengthen America's security. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
We now welcome our witnesses. Ms. Jennifer Shasky Calvery is the Director of the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, at the U.S. Department of Treasury. This will be Ms. Shasky Calvery's last congressional testimony for FinCEN. She's stepping down after having served as Director since September 23, 2012. Prior to joining Treasury, Ms. Shasky Calvery had a 15-year career at the Justice Department where she focused on combating money laundering and organized crime. Notably, she was a prosecutor with the Organized Crime and Racketeering Section, and more recently, Chief of the Asset Forfeiture and Money Laundering Section. Ms. Shasky holds a law degree from the University of Arizona College of Law. She graduated summa cum laude with an undergraduate degree in International Affairs from George Washington University, where she was also an all-star basketball player. And I just want to say, as you conclude your work at FinCEN, we all appreciate your incredible work for our nation, and that you would take some time at this point to brief our task force here on our issues of mutual concern, so we appreciate that. Mr. Larry McDonald is Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Technical Assistance, or OTA, at the U.S. Department of Treasury. He oversees a program that provides financial technical assistance to approximately 50 countries. In 2004, Mr. McDonald received the Secretary's honor. Mr. McDonald has served in several senior roles at Treasury since joining the department in 1987. Previously, Mr. McDonald worked at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Mr. McDonald has a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and an undergraduate degree from Middlebury College. The witnesses will now have 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of their testimony. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made a part of the record following their oral remarks. Once the witnesses have finished presenting their testimony, each member of the task force will have 5 minutes within which to ask questions. For the witnesses, on your table there are 3 lights, green, yellow, and red. Yellow means you have 1 minute remaining. Red, your time is up. Please make sure you're speaking directly into the microphones, which are fairly sensitive. And with that, Ms. Shasky Calvery, you're recognized now for 5 minutes.
Chairman Fitzpatrick, Ranking Member Lynch, and distinguished members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to appear today to discuss FinCEN's role in countering the financing of terrorism. We value the committee's attention to this issue. Today, I'll discuss FinCEN's view of the terrorist financing landscape in ways that we understand current and future threats, risks, and vulnerabilities. FinCEN's mission is to safeguard the financial system from illicit use, combat money laundering, and promote national security through the collection, analysis, and dissemination of financial intelligence and strategic use of financial authorities. We serve 2 roles. First, as the Financial Intelligence Unit, or FIU, of the United States, we collect, analyze, and disseminate financial intelligence to help fight money laundering and the financing of terrorism. Second, we serve as the lead anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism regulator for the federal government. The Treasury Department combats terrorist financing by identifying and disrupting the flow of financial resources to terrorist and terrorist organizations and hardening the international financial system from abuse by illicit actors. FinCEN supports these broader efforts by identifying sources of revenue for terrorist organizations and identifying their attempts to access the international financial system. FinCEN then uses its authorities to eliminate these access points. ISIL, of course, is one of the primary terrorist threats we're focused on today. FinCEN receives approximately 55,000 financial institution filings each day. Most of this financial intelligence comes from 2 reporting streams: large cash transactions exceeding $10,000 and suspicious transactions identified by financial institutions. To manage this collection, we use business rules or algorithms to identify reports meriting further review. Currently, we run 22 rules aimed at 1, cutting off ISIL's sources of revenue and attempts to access the international financial system, and 2, identifying potential foreign terrorist fighters. These rules generate over 1,000 matches each month, and about 10% of those matches result in reports sent to domestic authorities and foreign FIUs. FinCEN also employs its unique regulatory authorities to obtain special collections of financial intelligence from industry, which has been used to inform government efforts to counter ISIL's financial activities. This work confirms our belief in industry's desire to assist our efforts, not merely out of a sense of obligation, but as active participants. Financial intelligence plays an important role in preventing terrorist attacks. Authorities worldwide have an interest in identifying potential foreign terrorist fighters, many of whom have engaged in terrorist acts in jurisdictions outside the conflict zone. FinCEN shares its financial intelligence through secure channels to authorized stakeholders on the widest possible basis. We disseminate information to our law enforcement partners, intelligence authorities, and border police. For example, financial intelligence has allowed us to assist U.S. Customs and Border Protection with the watch listing of potential terrorists, as well as identifying individuals of concern that have subsequently had their visas revoked or denied or have been placed on the U.S. no-fly list. We also share with relevant foreign FIUs. We do this because terrorists and terrorist facilitators move from one jurisdiction to the next, and we do not hold all the pieces of the puzzle. The feedback suggests we're taking the right approach. Over the past 8 months, we've received 354 positive responses from 41 foreign FIUs that the financial intelligence we provided either corroborated information related to an ongoing investigation or provided new investigative leads. Financial transparency is also key to our counter-terrorist financing efforts. On May 6th, the President announced several developments to strengthen our work in this area, including a customer due diligence, or CDD, rule and proposed beneficial ownership legislation. The CDD rule requires that covered financial institutions know and verify the identities of the natural persons who own, control, and profit from the legal entities that financial institutions service. Treasury also sent beneficial ownership legislation to Congress that would require companies to know and report adequate, accurate, and current beneficial ownership information at the time of a company's formation and transfer. These two initiatives actually dovetail together and are critical to aid law enforcement efforts to safeguard the financial system. Being able to identify who the real people are that are involved in a transaction is critical to our work to combat money laundering and terrorism. The terrorist financing landscape is complex and dynamic. We must continue our dialogue to ensure we have the right regulatory and statutory structure to prevent abuse of our financial system while striking the right balance between personal privacy and financial transparency. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Larry McDonald, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Fitzpatrick, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. It's a pleasure to participate with my colleague, Jen Shasky. Treasury's Technical Assistance Program, specifically the Economic Crimes Team within that program, has a close and effective partnership with FinCEN based on our institutional mandates and our special expertise. We are, respectively, the capacity building and the operational arms of Treasury's work to combat terrorist financing and financial crimes. Together, we are part of a coordinated overall U.S. government effort. Treasury's Office of Technical Assistance, or OTA, as we call it, is comprised of 5 teams: economic crimes, banking, revenue, budget, and debt management. OTA's economic crimes team promotes compliance with international standards and best practices, in particular the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. The crimes team partners with foreign financial intelligence units as well as regulatory, analytical, law enforcement, and judicial authorities tasked with developing effective AML-CFT regimes. OTA is a relatively small program, and the economic crimes team is smaller still. Total OTA funding is approximately $50 million per year, which supports about 100 projects in 50 countries. Total funding for the Economic Crimes Team is about $7.5 million per year, which currently supports 15 projects in Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Middle East. While small, OTA is, we believe, a cost-effective program that punches above its weight. As Secretary Lew put it during this committee's March hearing on the international financial system, Treasury gets, quote, more bang for the buck out of OTA than anything else. I refer you to my written testimony and to OTA's annual report to Congress for examples of successful engagements by the Economic Crimes Team and other parts of OTA. Let me share with you a few lessons from our experience regarding effective technical assistance. Effective technical assistance depends on many things. Assistance providers, for their part, must show some restraint, allowing potential country partners to step forward of their own volition with clear expressions of interest. Once interest has been manifested, technical assistance providers must be good listeners and patient analysts in order to understand the real underlying problems and the capacity of the requester to absorb assistance. This is the essence of demand-driven assistance. Technical assistance providers must also demonstrate a commitment to coordination. Coordination may entail doing a project differently or not doing it at all, depending on what other assistance providers are doing. There are cases when OTA changes its project or even declines a request to provide technical assistance when we determine that another provider is already involved and our work would be duplicative. Effective coordination is also facilitated when assistance providers focus their work on areas where they have special expertise and an institutional mandate. OTA's Economic Crimes Team has special expertise in building the human capacity of financial intelligence units and working through those financial intelligence units to enhance the effectiveness of other AML-CFT regime stakeholders. For AML-CFT assistance to be effective, recipients, for their part, must be genuinely committed to a systemic approach to AML-CFT regime development. The weak link breaks the chain. Effective AML-CFT regime development requires strengthening and integrating the work of the entire spectrum of AML-CFT stakeholders. The goal is a system in which both prevention and enforcement measures are mutually reinforcing. Governments that receive technical assistance must show a commitment to creating and retaining a core of professionals, career professionals. It's disheartening when a change of government in our partner countries results in the departure of our technical level colleagues. Finally, and most importantly, technical assistance must be backed up in our partner countries by a commitment at the policy and the political levels to push for transparency and accountability in public finance when, inevitably, entrenched interests resist. In conclusion, let me reemphasize that combating terrorist financing, money laundering, and other financial crimes is a top priority for the Treasury Department and the U.S. government. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I appreciate your support and interest and welcome your questions.
We thank the witnesses for their opening statements. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Ms. Shasky, could you talk to us about the impact that technology has had on the fight against terror finance and how Treasury plans to, and FinCEN plan to adapt?
Yeah, I think there's been both positive and negative ramifications of advances in technology. On the positive end, we're using advanced analytics at FinCEN to comb through the data we receive. As I mentioned earlier, we receive 55,000 filings on average from financial institutions each day. So the idea that we would have human beings able to comb through all of that information and understand it is I think, beyond our capacity for sure. And we need technology to help us go through that data. We use advanced analytics and business rules to help us understand what's important and get it to law enforcement in a timely manner. So now from the time that a bank files a suspicious activity report to the time we get it in the hands of law enforcement, maybe 24 to 48 hours. If it's a terrorism-related issue, they'll call our hotline and we'll get it to them even faster. But just things going through the normal system, it takes 24 to 48 hours for us to get it in the hands of people who can take action. So that's the positive benefits of technology. Of course, with technological innovation, we also have advances in the finance industry and new products and services coming on board. Many of those products and services, provide potential opportunities for greater efficiencies, good lowering costs, providing better services. But we also need to keep abreast of what financial crimes risks they pose, and are they covered by regulations? Are we still going to be able to collect information? So that's one of the challenges we take on at FinCEN, to try to stay abreast of the ever-changing technology in the fintech arena. And we've also attempted to reflect some responsibility back on industry itself, encouraging the developers of fintech to also be thinking about compliance and thinking about information sharing when they're developing their products and services, so that they can accomplish those ends as well.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald, can you comment on the role that the National Security Council plays in prioritizing and directing interagency efforts, role of Treasury with respect to the Council, and Mr. Shasky, you might want to suggest also.
The National Security Council plays a role in both the setting of what I would call the strategic outlines of our technical assistance strategy, and also, in cases where it's required, helping to break through instances where there might be a lack of mutual understanding among agencies about what is a priority country, what is a priority region, what's a priority engagement. Our coordination work truly begins before it gets to the National Security Council within the Treasury Department, working with our colleagues in terrorist financing and financial crimes in the first instance, working with the State Department, both its regional bureaus, with INL, the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement part of the State Department, working with the State Department's Office on Counterterrorism. So in most instances, I would say, we are able to agree on a plan of action and a game plan without necessarily involving the National Security Council. But there are instances, certainly at the very beginning of that process, when you're looking at the broad outlines of a strategy, and then in those instances where there's something that needs to be worked out and the NSC's participation is important or essential.
Director Shasky?
I think Larry put it well. Essentially, the National Security Council sets the strategic direction based on the coordinated input of all of the agencies, and then holds us accountable for actually implementing what we said we would do.
Director, can you comment on the methodologies that FinCEN uses in looking for or spotting trade-based money laundering schemes, particular methodologies?
Sure. I think most recently, the methodologies we've employed have been with the use of our geographic targeting order, which is an authority that enables the director to put in place a special collection of information for a limited time period, 120 days. So we've been using that most recently in California and in South Florida, where we understood from law enforcement and working closely with our law enforcement partners, understood that there was an issue of trade-based money laundering in the garment district in LA and the electronics district in South Florida. And essentially, drug cash, law enforcement believed that drug cash was making its way into businesses and then back down to Mexico and or Colombia. So we used the geographic targeting order to collect additional information. Law enforcement was able to see how the criminal actors diverted their actions, what evasive steps they took, and most recently it resulted in over 20 arrests in South Florida, and has really helped both us and law enforcement to understand the typologies much better.
Thank you. Recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And Ms. Calvery, I want to join the chairman in thanking you for your service to your country and wishing you well. Let's stay right on that topic of, I know that one of the things that we're working on with my staff and with Treasury is to work on legislation to expand that geographic targeting order. Could you elaborate a little bit why that would be helpful?
Sure, and thank you for the question. So right now, the geographic targeting order enables us to collect information when there's a transaction involving monetary instruments. So that's like cash, currency, or checks. We would propose expanding that for us to collect information when there's a transaction involving funds, the more broad definition. So that would include, for instance, wire transfers. And where that, an example of where that's important is with our real estate GTO. There we're focused on criminals who are taking their illicit proceeds and using it to purchase luxury residential real estate. Right now we have GTOs focused in Manhattan and in Miami County. And with those two geographic targeting orders, we're able to collect information when someone uses cash or a check to purchase real estate, some portion of real estate. We're not able to do it, however, when someone wires funds to purchase real estate, and that is becoming the more and more common way that people engage in transactions.
Great. Let me ask, and this is for both of the witnesses, the Panama Papers, that whole incident, it just shed light on the role of offshore financial mechanisms to move and store money anonymously. That issue, along with the beneficial ownership issue, creates a real problem for all of us on this committee and law enforcement as well. To what extent, as far as it has been reported, I'm not sure how to put this. What role, if any, do you think FATF might have in verifying the information contained in the Panama Papers, and how might we use this information to address the terrorism-related issues?
All right, I'd be happy to field that one. I probably would not look to FATF in the first instance as the body to engage in the investigation and operational activity surrounding the Panama Papers.
Well, maybe I'm just looking for lessons learned. If for what we understand what's been going on, and this, I understand it's powerful individuals be able to move their money offshore. Well, they could do that for terrorist financing as well. If they're coming out of the Gulf or something like that. So, are there some lessons learned that we might use in our context, which is terrorist financing?
Yeah, actually, now that I better understand the question, FATF does have a role, and I think they have been playing it. First, they have set an international standard around the collection of beneficial ownership information. They have made it clear that countries should be collecting beneficial ownership information to better enable their ability to fight money laundering and terrorist finance. So that's the international standard. Here in the United States, we've made some progress, but have some work to do on that front. The CDD rule, I think, was a definite step forward in terms of the collection of beneficial ownership information. What that enables us to do is to have our banks collecting information on legal entities when they're customers or when they're providing them services, no matter where that legal entity was formed, whether it was formed in the U.S., BVI, et cetera, et cetera. The beneficial ownership legislation that we recently proposed dovetails with that, because that would require the collection of beneficial ownership information at the time a U.S. legal entity is formed in the United States or when it's transferred. And that's important because we often will see illicit actors take U.S. legal entities outside of the United States to use them to establish bank accounts, and that money end up right back in the U.S. financial system indirectly through correspondent accounts. And so to be able to deal with both risks, we need both authorities in place.
Thank you. And in closing, I just want to say, one of the, and Mr. McDonald, you could obviously add to this if you wish, but from a lot of people that we talk to in this area, the United States facilitates some of this because of our laws, because of our unwillingness to deal with the beneficial ownership issue, and we basically turn a blind eye to this and let this happen. Is that correct? Is that your
What I was going to do was add just quickly to Jen's point about Panama to say that the technical assistance program is engaged in Panama. I have visited myself the financial intelligence unit there and met with their team. They're not the worst. They're not the best around the world. They do have a financial intelligence unit that has good leadership, but they're still at the relatively early stages of implementing improved laws related to reporting requirements, and we're still in sort of the middle ground of trying to build their capacity to make them more effective in that role.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman of the Task Force, Mr. Pittenger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you again. My question relates to our collaborative efforts with our partners around the globe. In our meetings in South America with Colombia and Paraguay and Panama and Argentina, we found, as I said earlier, willing partners. But, Ms. McDonald, as you said earlier in your statement, that we're only as strong as our weakest link. And in discussions I've had previously with President El-Sisi and other foreign leaders, they've also expressed a willingness but did not have the capacity to really be a strong asset in our efforts. How do you all work together? Kind of walk through with me assessing the needs and what needs to be done through OTA and the role that you play with FinCEN, Ms. Shasky Calvery, and how do y'all address that, and then how do we establish that relationship with them, and then provide them the leadership and the support that they need?
I'll kick it off. Central America is a good place to look at as an example of this. Our technical assistance efforts begin in most regions, and including in Central America, with an expression of interest, a request by the potential counterparts. It might be from the financial intelligence unit. It might be at a more senior level when finance minister or central bank governor is in Washington talking to the secretary at the time of IMF World Bank annual meetings or something like that. And for one reason or another, they have a recognition that they need to do better. It might be because they are more aware of the threat of illicit finance. It might be that they are seeing the departure of foreign banks who are trying to deal with this problem of de-risking. And they will ask us if we can be helpful to them in strengthening their system. We will typically get in touch with the State Department, both in Washington and with the embassy. In Central America, I can tell you that there is a particularly good collaboration between the State Department's INL, responsible for Central America. The Central American Regional Security Initiative is one in which we co-fund projects in Central America and talk to each other about a game plan for TA. But then ultimately, it does require a follow-through on the part of leadership in our partner countries to implement the strengthened capacities that we try to help them build. Guatemala is an interesting case in point. They, over a number of years, built their capacity to identify and address money laundering cases. In 2014, they took down a money laundering operation and sentenced the ringleader and 7 of their participants to a number of years in jail. I would just say one last point about our collaboration with FinCEN. While FinCEN is really the operational arm of Treasury's efforts, as I said earlier, and OTA is the capacity building arm, we know that FinCEN has expertise that we can benefit from. So at a staff level, we are frequently in interaction with each other about things that FinCEN knows a lot about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Shasky Calvery.
Yeah, I think to just give a real practical example in the area of terrorist financing, of how we help some of the FIUs that might have less capacity to do their job. Recently, in this last year, we brought 40 FIUs together, the United States, FinCEN, and the Netherlands FIU led an effort where 40 FIUs focused on the issue of foreign terrorist fighters and trying to understand what they look like in financial data. What are their financial patterns? What do they look like before they get to the conflict zone? What do they look like when they're in transit? And what do they look like when they get back? Because we all have an interest in identifying these individuals. So 40 countries came together. We looked at patterns all across the world. We came up with red flags for industry of what type of activity they should be looking out for. We then drafted an advisory to financial institutions. Here in the United States, we issued it securely to our financial institutions, and then we provided a sample to over 150 FIUs of that same advisory for them to issue to their financial institutions. So in that way, you have 40 FIUs that are better situated to perhaps understand the threats, articulate the threats, help the other members of the Egmont group of FIUs to take information and get it out to their industry, and thereby get better reporting from industry back to FIUs.
My time is...
I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to both of our witnesses for their very important service to our country. As you're certainly aware, one of the issues in the Iran nuclear deal was the possibility of Iran diverting some fraction of their funds that were released under the JCPOA for terrorist purposes. So I actually have a pair of related questions. The first one is, how specifically does FinCEN guard against Iran illicitly accessing the U.S. financial system? And secondly, recently the Secretary of State and Treasury both stated that Iran at that time had access to only about $3 billion of the amount made available to it under the JCPOA. And so I was wondering, has that number increased since those statements were made? Do we have the ability to track actually how much they've received? And could you explain how that funding is being made available to Iran so far, and how we're able to follow it under the state sponsorship of terrorist sanctions?
Sure. Let me focus on FinCEN's role in understanding and tracking financial transactions from Iran. Our data is collected from U.S. financial institutions, and of course, U.S. financial institutions are still embargoed from dealing with Iran in almost all circumstances. So we don't tend to have a lot of direct open data about Iranian financial transactions. We do, however, receive information and keep on alert for any type of front companies that might be used to access the dollar or the U.S. financial system, and work very closely with our colleagues at OFAC to understand those financial transactions and to follow their funds. In terms of some of your more specific questions about the amount of money that Iran has at its disposal at this moment, I really would have to defer to some of my colleagues at OFAC to help me answer that question, so I'd be happy to take that back and get you
I'd appreciate it. I mean, that's a number that I think Congress will have a great interest in tracking, and so if there was some information channel so we could have some authoritative statement about what that number was, that would be very useful. Second question, sort of unrelated. Many of the financial services players that are involved in the payment chain are actually regulated and supervised at the state level. And so could you describe the coordination between FinCEN and the states, since it's obviously critical to ensuring that the financial services sector is not used for illicit purposes?
Sure. This is an issue that we focus on quite a bit at FinCEN, and particularly in the last year, we've really been focused on money services businesses and their supervision. So they are licensed by states. Money services businesses in this country are licensed by states and supervised both by states and IRS. And then FinCEN's responsible for any enforcement actions that might come out of that. So as a result of the Money Remittances Improvement Act of 2014, we have been coordinating more than ever between the federal and the state system. So the states have, for instance, a data system in which they can collect licensing information and put their supervisory exams and all of this type of information into one data system. And we have signed a memorandum of understanding so that we too now get access to that data. And together, the federal government and the states, there's about 30 states that participated at this point, are able to look at trends and identify risks and better focus our exams. We're doing coordination of our exams. We're doing joint exams. And that's in the money services business arena, but we also coordinate quite closely across depository institutions and other types of financial institutions.
Yeah, thank you. So you view the situation as improving at a satisfactory rate in terms of the state regulated?
I do think it's improving. A major, area of focus has been to communicate to our banks and to our federal banking agencies the supervision that is in place for money services businesses. I think there had been a lack of understanding and a lack of communication on how well they are regulated and what that regulation looks like in detail, so that there could be some understanding of how that works.
All right. Thank you. And I was also interested in your comments about shell corporations and real estate transactions. First, I'm wondering if you have any comments on proposals that have been floating around in Congress for a while to basically pierce the corporate veil in the U.S., to just not allow anonymous shell corporations to be made, which I guess is what many countries have. Would that have a big influence on your ability to do your job?
It would have a very large influence on our ability to do our job. I think this is actually the fourth time over 8 years that I've testified in front of Congress on this issue, and the one thing that I think has been consistent throughout, and some of that was with the Department of Justice and some of that has been with Treasury, the one consistent theme throughout is that criminals, terrorists, and other illicit actors use shell companies and hide behind the corporate veil as a means of engaging in illicit transactions anonymously. And so anything we can do to take that away and provide greater financial transparency would be of great aid to law enforcement and to combating money laundering and terrorist finance. So the beneficial ownership legislation that the president sent up to Congress recently, I think sets out a good plan on how to do that. But we're certainly interested in working with Congress on a proposal that'll work.
Thank you. I guess at this point, I'm out of time, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Calvery and Mr. McDonald, for being here. We appreciate your leadership on this issue and your service to our country. I think everybody knows with the activities we've seen around the globe over the past couple of years that it is absolutely critical for our own national security that we win this war on terror. And part of that is making sure we stop the money flows to terrorist organizations around the world. In particular, I'd like to focus a little bit here on the Patriot Act in Section 314B that deals with information sharing, financial information sharing among financial institutions. So my question to you, Ms. Calvery, first is, I'm sure you're familiar with that section of the law. Do you see those rules as being too restrictive for financial institutions to be able to share this information such that they can see patterns of money flows around the world, such they can pinpoint a way to interrupt this flow of funding?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I'm very familiar with Section 314B and 314A. We use them quite extensively at FinCEN. I think there are some improvements that could be made to the statute, and in particular, clarifying right now, so 314B, of course, allows financial institutions to share information with one another concerning suspicious activity related to money laundering and terrorist finance. It would be helpful to clarify that authority extends beyond a strict reading of money laundering and terrorist finance, but applies to all crimes. Money laundering, of course, has many, many predicates to it, and we think it would be helpful to make it clear that financial institutions can share information with one another about suspicious activity involving violations of criminal law and regulations. Likewise, there's been some issues in the courts, and there's now an inconsistency in the court rulings on whether or not the safe harbor that financial institutions get when they file a suspicious activity report, whether they had to have a good faith belief that the criminal activity occurred. And we see that as chilling on financial institutions, and we would certainly support a change to make it clear that a good faith belief that criminal activity has occurred is not required to file a SAR.
Let's drill down a little bit deeper, if I can, Ms. Calvery. Talk to me a little bit about the sharing of information, of course, with relevant safeguards among financial institutions in the federal government. Could you please comment on that? How is that working? Can you see any changes that government can make to make that better? You've listed a couple when it comes to dealing with financial institutions themselves. Now it's still the government in.
Yeah, so there's less needed in terms of authorities to make that better, more needed in terms of innovation and activity on the ground. And I think that's happening. It's really been an exciting development over the last year. We have been partnering, FinCEN has been partnering with law enforcement and financial institutions using the 314A and B authorities to share information on a more real-time, iterative basis, where FinCEN will have a meeting with specific financial institutions that can help on a specific problem and provide context of the request we're about to make to them, to enable them to go back and look in their data and do a better job of finding relevant information. It also enables them to talk amongst themselves, the financial institutions to talk and share information amongst themselves. And that type of joint iterative activity is we found to be much more productive.
Great. I represent a very highly rural part of America. We have the largest congressional district in Maine, east of the Mississippi River. Is this problem of funding or stopping the flow of funds to terrorist organizations unique to large money center institutions? What advice can you give our folks back in Maine that deal with small financial institutions and mostly in rural areas that they can be on the lookout for these sort of activities that they ordinarily might not catch?
Well, unfortunately, I think we've seen that individuals have been radicalized in all different types of communities of different sizes, in cities, in rural areas. And so then the money flows also follow where the radicalization occurs. And to put it more concretely, of those business rules I was talking about earlier and the alerts that we get on activity related to potential terrorist activity, ISIL activity specifically, most of that reporting comes from depository institutions. About 60-some% comes from depository institution, maybe 37% from money services businesses. Most of it comes from large financial institutions, which, by the way, are also in smaller areas at the retail level. But some of it is also coming from small community banks and small MSBs. I recall seeing at least one report where it was a mom and pop money services convenience store / money services business operation, and they provided some very important reporting for law enforcement.
Mr. Chair, I'm just about out of my time, but if I could ask one more question, is that possible, sir? My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Poliquin. Chair now recognizes Mr. Kildee of Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses for their participation. I'd like to start with Ms. Calvery, if you could offer some comments on the basic subject of Iran and sanctions. And I referred to a speech that Secretary Lew gave back in March, where he indicated it was his view that the credibility of sanctions themselves are at stake if the promise of sanctions relief can't be fully realized. So I guess I'm curious to what extent you think that criticism is valid, how it might apply more broadly than just to Iran sanctions, and how effective you think Treasury's sanctions regime has been effective. If you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
So I have not left government service yet. That'll be next week. So I'm going to start by saying whatever the secretary said, I agree with. Actually, I do agree.
I'm sure he'll be very much encouraged by that.
Even next week, you'll get that same answer. But joking aside, at FinCEN, we're not the sanctions experts. We support our colleagues at OFAC in their investigations by getting them the financial intelligence they need. What I can tell you is I am very impressed by their seriousness of effort and their ability to fashion sanctions in a very targeted manner, their ability to work with changing scenario on the ground, a changing diplomatic situation on the ground, to impose sanctions and to be flexible in moving those sanctions as needed. But in terms of the specifics, I really need to refer you to my colleagues at OFAC.
Then if I could zero in on something where FinCEN would clearly have some role, and that is implementation of the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act. Could you comment on the extent to which that is being implemented and how you feel it is succeeding in limiting the ability of Hezbollah to raise, to move, to use funds in pursuit of their terrorist aims?
Yeah, so FinCEN's role when it comes to the financing of Hezbollah is, in the collection of information and sharing that, whether it's with OFAC to focus on the sanctions side or the implementation of the act, sharing it with law enforcement and the intelligence community. We've used both our traditional authorities to collect that information, so the suspicious activity reporting and that type of thing, but we've also used some of our targeted authorities. We've used, for instance, Section 311 of the Patriot Act to focus on foreign financial institutions that we believed were moving funds on behalf of Hezbollah, and to cut them off from the U.S. financial system and to collect additional information. We did that in the case of Lebanese Canadian Bank, in the case of a couple money services businesses, Halawi and Ramadi. So that's where we kind of fit into this bigger Hezbollah picture.
Okay. The last question I have returns to the issue I think Mr. Foster had raised it to a certain extent. And I, coming from Michigan, one of my longtime mentors is former Senator Carl Levin, who has spoken out pretty clearly on this issue of beneficial ownership and various methods that have shielded true ownership or true beneficiaries of ownership. I dealt with it on a much smaller scale. For many years, I was a county treasurer trying to deal with abandoned properties and trying to locate owners through various clouds of ownership and shell corporations. And I'm just curious if you would comment on what you think, either of you or both of you, what would be the essential elements of beneficial ownership legislation that would actually get at the question? I know Senator Levin had some concern that from a regulatory standpoint, allowing only managers to be named rather than true owners might really be a step backward rather than a step forward. I wonder if you'd comment.
Sure. So I too am from Michigan. I grew up in Michigan, and
Blue.
Senator Levin spoke at my 8th grade Constitutional Convention Day. So I look at Senator Levin a bit as a mentor myself.
Great.
However, I do disagree with him on the characterization of the definition of beneficial ownership in the CDD rule in a fairly fundamental way. The definition has two prongs to it. It would require individuals to provide information about someone who controls a company, so that could be the manager, director, et cetera, someone who has actual control over the company, and those individuals that have an equity stake in the company, at least 25% of an equity stake in the company. So it requires both of those things. And the reason that we went in that direction, and I first got involved in this definition when I was at the Department of Justice, and I was being asked personally, what does law enforcement need? We know that criminals are going to try to hide. They'll never actually give their name. So what does law enforcement need to actually be able to take the next step in their investigation? And our response, my response, was we need something more than a nominee. When law enforcement looks at a name on a piece of paper, they need to be able to go out, knock on someone's door, and that person has to have some connection to the bad guy, because now they have something to work with. If it's a nominee that doesn't know the bad guy, it's a dead end. And that's the situation we have been in, a dead end. Now, there is someone for law enforcement to go talk to, someone who controls the company and someone who has an equity interest in the company on paper. No bad guy is going to stay very far away than the person who is actually able to control their money day to day. They're going to have some connection back and forth, and that enables law enforcement to take the next step in their investigation. And that's why I think that definition will prove helpful and effective in the CDD context. But through the beneficial ownership legislation that we've proposed, it requires a rulemaking process, and I think it's a fair game to again examine, is that the right definition in that context, or is there a better definition that we should put in place? And that's what the rulemaking process is for.
I see my time has expired. I do think it's a subject that requires a lot more exploration. My experience has been it's difficult sometimes to separate a designated manager from an equity owner, and I have seen it where it might appear as if you're dealing with someone that has a real stake, but often, and this again is in a limited scale, but I can't imagine it's less complicated in terrorism financing. I think it's a difficult area that we need to explore further. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your flexibility.
Thank you. Mr. Rothfuss of Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McDonald, I wondered if I could ask you a couple questions. From your position at OTA, can you tell us how receptive developing countries are, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, to integrating efforts to block terrorist financing as a priority concern and accepting assistance from the United States, other G20 countries, or the IMF or development banks to identify and address issues in their nation?
So Africa and the Middle East covers a lot of territory. There are a lot of different countries and very different circumstances. So I'm going to avoid giving you just one paintbrush description of it. In sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, I think the overriding challenge and problem is not so much one of a lack of willingness to give attention to this issue and to try to do better. It is fundamentally and primarily one of very low capacity, very limited, sometimes non-existent technology. We talked earlier about the role of technology. I'll give you an example in Liberia, where we are engaging. Our economic crimes team, in their assessment mission, went to the financial intelligence unit. It had ankle deep in water. There were plastic chairs, maybe one computer. I mean, it's really unbelievably limited in terms of the human and kind of material capacity to do that job. That's an extreme example. There are other parts of sub-Saharan Africa that are far better. We work, for example, in Kenya and Tanzania, different picture. But by and large, sub-Saharan Africa, it's fundamentally a challenge of having the resources and the capacity. In the Middle East, it is, I don't want to say that capacity is not at issue. It certainly is. Depending on the country you're talking about, whether it's Saudi Arabia, where we have an engagement, or Iraq, where we are resuming an engagement. It's a mixed picture. It's a combination of limited capacity. Certainly it is the case in Iraq, but also in Iraq in particular, a very a political and security environment that is turbulent, to say the least. So our technical assistance efforts in a country like Iraq, where I went on mission in November to try to reestablish our engagement, is one where there are some improvements. The legal regime has been strengthened by passage of new legislation. There has been there's been some changes within the central bank and the financial intelligence unit that are promising, but it's a region that is characterized by tremendous political and security upheaval.
You mentioned a willingness on the part of sub-Saharan African countries to look at these issues, but there's a capacity issue. Middle East, there are some capacity issues, but can you address the willingness issue with those Middle East countries, Gulf states, other countries in the Middle East?
So I would hesitate to characterize the willingness of all the countries in the Middle East. The ones that I'm most familiar with are Iraq. We almost had an engagement in Yemen until things went in a different direction there. We have worked in Jordan, where I think as one of the other members of the panel noted, there has been improvements in their FIU work and their AML-CFT regime. So it really depends on the country. I would just say that it is highly country specific.
I'd like to ask maybe about the impact on the willingness of countries, whether in Africa or the Middle East, with respect to recent activity. Do you think that these countries are more or less receptive to working with us when they see the Secretary of State holding public meetings with some of the biggest banks in Europe to encourage investment and business in Iran, the world's largest state sponsor of terror? Is there an inconsistency there?
I haven't talked to them about that. I couldn't say that is a top. I've never had. Let me put it this way. I've never had any of my interlocutors in the Middle East tell me that they felt differently about the issue because of the factor that you mentioned.
Ms. Shasky, Calvery, if I just commend you on your work and congratulate you and wish you well on your next endeavor. As you look back on your service, where do you think the United States has failed with respect to the prevention of terrorism financing, and where do you see the biggest vulnerabilities going forward?
I don't know if I would characterize it as failure as much as needing to consistently improve. So I think it was Churchill who said something to the effect of change is good and constant change is to be perfect. We need to constantly be changing in the government and evolving with the threat. And the threat, you've got state actors, you've got illicit actors who have billions of dollars at their disposal to be able to pay the best attorneys, the best accountants, the best bankers to come up with the most sophisticated schemes to hide illicit assets. And that's the charge we have, is to keep up with that. So we need to remain vigilant with a determined adversary and ensure that we keep changing with the times and understanding the risks. That's not easy to do. What I see is the primary risks going forward are really what we had in the threat assessment, that we handed into FATF. This idea that the chairman raised at the beginning, that we have an incredibly complex financial system, the largest financial system, brings with it unique threats. We need to understand the full gamut of how all our financial industry works, all the different aspects of it, the various products and services, and then understand that the volume of transactions that go through the U.S. financial system is immense. So it's trying to remain focused on a big field of vulnerabilities to find a very narrow stream of illicit activity that's flowing through it. That's probably our biggest challenge moving forward.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Shasky, Calvery. So only a week left?
3 days.
3 days, okay. So let's actually, because I think we always make a mistake of, in some of these discussions, we at one point we're talking about our sort of formal networks and the informal and terrorism financing and other bad actors and these dollar scales. So let's just do a quick thought experiment. Mm-hmm. You've been doing this for how long?
Almost 20 years.
Okay, so you've seen lots of creativity and things you never thought of all of a sudden appearing. So if I took you and put you on the other side of the world tomorrow and said, here's a $500,000 in cash, because that's the type of threat that we often worry about, because that buys people who mean harm to us, and said, you're on the other side of the world, here's your $500,000, get it somewhere to someone in somewhere in North America, and you got 10 days to do it. You could do that.
I'm not offering those for
No,
sale,
I'm not
but yes.
saying how. We're not going to put on the how. But, look, I sit here in this committee, and I know I could do it.
Yes.
Through breaking it up in all sorts of different networks, and some in hard commodities, some in this, some in that, some in a DHL package. It's quite doable, isn't it?
Potentially, yes.
Potentially, or just it's doable.
It's doable.
And there becomes sort of my concern of so much of our resources we fixate on, okay, we're going to watch the SWIFT system, we're going to track this, track that. At the same time, a handful of diamonds shoved into a package, being sent to some. There's lots of ways to move resources to finance bad actors. And so I want to sort of bounce on to sort of the next concept. Someone in a very similar position for another three-letter agency who's an acquaintance talked me through saying that some of the networks that wash money for someone selling copyright violations or illicit drugs, also that these networks are basically for sale. So they don't really care where you got the money, if you're moving money for terrorism, if you're moving money for a cartel, if you're moving money for this. There's entire networks basically that sell their services. Is that a fair characterization?
That is a fair characterization.
So functionally, money laundering, money movement, asset movement is a formal business in a corrupt sector.
Yes, I would call them professional money launderers.
Okay, so in many ways, isn't that somewhat of our mistakes? Being someone from a border state, some of the crazy things that we've come across, in a previous life when we were rehabbing houses, we walked into a house that had a bundle of cash in it that was getting ready to be loaded up and taken back south. I mean, the things you come across. So my concern is, do we spend too much in the way of our resources saying we're going to monitor and build algorithms and look at the SWIFT system and not understanding there's hundreds and hundreds of different ways to be creative or break it up or use parts? I mean, there's so much of our focus on the formal banking sector that there's massive leakage around us.
So I think you need financial intelligence to identify those professional money launderers and facilitators to be able to go after them. And I think they, in turn, ultimately need the formal financial system to be able to move money globally, particularly when you start talking about large sums of money. So when you're talking about something like a Sinaloa cartel that by all estimates has billions of dollars that it needs to launder, they need to do that through the formal financial system.
You just moved to where I was trying to do this. So it's the very large-scale amounts of money that are going to use or try to access our more formal networks because of the efficiencies. So
not necessarily. We also see it, for instance, in the case of foreign terrorist fighters who have extremely small amounts of money. They're essentially trying to pay for their travel to the conflict zone or perhaps for the weaponry that they're going to need when they're in the conflict.
But they also have access to ability to move small dollars and lots of informal sort of networks.
But they're doing it through the formal financial system.
So in the formal sector, how many, let's just use an example. How many Iranian institutions now have access to SWIFT?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, because that's one of the things we've been tracking, because I believe there now are some SWIFT relationships with some Iranian institutions to European banks, and once that money hits a European institution, the ability to move money back into North America, even if we still have, a 311 sanctions on that institution, they still basically have access to the world's backbone. Is that sort of, am I heading the right direction there?
Not necessarily. I think we have, in terms of Iran's access to the U.S. financial system, I don't think they have.
But if they have access to Europe and the ability then, so if I can SWIFT money, to a European institution, straw man it out, wash it back out, and then send it SWIFT back through, under a different sender. My concern is our resources seem to focus on the formal networks, and my understanding is the scale of what we'll refer to as sort of the informal networks are also massive. And if, in our example, if I gave you the $500,000 and put you on the other side of the world, you might mix it up and use all sorts, and then when it hits the other side, it comes back together. And I've always, and I know I'm way over time, but thought it was absurd that we have a system where if I do $9,999, I don't get reported. If I do 10,000, I do get reported. So bad actors just do $9,999 and use other alternatives instead of just the fixation. Let's just use an algorithm system to look for, is a dollar, because a dollar threshold in some ways is absurd.
So there's a lot of things.
Yeah, I know, a lot of
that.
moving parts there. And we're way over time. But
Let me perhaps try to address some of it. We seek to collect financial intelligence and have transparency over those parts of the financial system that we think are the most vulnerable to illicit finance. And when you start talking about things like cash and following a bearer instrument like cash, we've focused on thresholds. But even with a threshold, we still have the suspicious activity reporting regime to support it. So if someone is doing transactions at $9,999, we expect to have a suspicious activity report. If someone is structuring several different transactions to get above $10,000, we expect to get a suspicious activity report.
thank you, Ms. Calvery. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your patience. I know we're way over time.
Thank you. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Fitzpatrick, and thanks to both of you for being here today. Mr. McDonald, one of the key themes of these task force hearings has been international cooperation. We, the United States, can only do so much on our own. While I believe our country is making great strides in combating the financing of terrorism, we still can do more, and we need to do more. In previous task force hearings, the committee has explored the idea of trade transparency units, which seeks to identify trade-based money laundering trends and conduct ongoing analysis of trade data provided through partnerships with other countries. One of our past witnesses, John Cassar, who is a former U.S. intelligence officer and Treasury special agent, testified that having TPP signatories agree to these TTUs would promote trade transparency. It would also be a revenue enhancer, in his opinion, not derail implementation of current or future trade deals. I wanted to get your thoughts on this idea of making sure that our trading partners are following the same set of rules as we do.
Let me kick it off, and I think Ms. Calvery has something that she could add to that. So certainly the trading system, the international trading system, is one of the vehicles for money laundering and transmitting terrorist financing. And it's one of the areas where we work with our partner countries to try to get them better positioned to be the front line of shutting that off. So we work with customs officials, we work with officials in countries that are responsible for managing and overseeing the trading, trade flows in those countries to try to strengthen their capacity, and I think this is part of your question, for them to work more closely with others in the United States and in other countries who are involved in trying to combat trade-based money laundering. So that is part of our work. Jen, I don't know if you have something you'd like to add to that.
Sure. FinCEN works very closely with Homeland Security investigations on a number of different matters, and CBP, on trade-based money laundering. So we're very familiar with the TTUs and think that they've really done a good job over the years. So a good example is the TTU that we have here and the relationship we have with Mexico. They're able to share trade information, extensive trade information, to find where there's been over-invoicing or under-invoicing of export and import trade between the two countries, and thereby find money that's being laundered. When you put that type of data together with the data we collect at FinCEN, we're really able to start to hone in on some professional money launderers and facilitation networks, and to take action.
Thank you. Mr. McDonald, last week I was encouraged to see G7 members agree to enhanced information sharing and cooperation when it comes to terror financing. This follows a similar agreement by the G20 nations. But when it comes to TPP, not all of the current signatories are part of the larger discussion. How receptive are developing countries to integrating efforts to block terrorist financing as a priority concern, and in turn accepting assistance from the U.S.? In other words, does it become beneficial for them to actually engage in this topic instead of turning a blind eye to it?
So broadly, I would say that developing countries are receptive to assistance and interested in strengthening their AML-CFT regimes in different ways. Part of it is a growing recognition on their part that terrorist financing, dirty money of different kinds, can harm them. Terrorist financing or funding that is being laundered in the direction of the United States doesn't always end up only here. The countries of Central America, South America, and other parts of the developing world, I think, are increasingly aware of their stake in trying to address this issue. As I said earlier, it's not only their concern about funding of criminal activity within their own countries, but also the loss of correspondent banking accounts upon which their financial system depends. So I do believe that they do recognize the importance of this issue, and while I can't speak for it's on a country-by-country basis whether they want to have a technical assistance program with us, they are interested.
All right, real quick, should TTU be a part of the TPP agreement?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question.
That's why I ask it.
I'll find out. Can I find out and get back to you?
Would you do that for me?
We'll do it today.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you and Ranking Member Lynch for your steady leadership of our task force. And Director Calvery, best wishes to you and your next step in your career. And Mr. McDonald, thank you for your service at Treasury. As a former Deputy Assistant Secretary at Treasury, I always appreciate hearing from a fresh one, and appreciate your work. I led the technical assistance designed to all of Central and Eastern Europe to the finance ministries from the Treasury back a quarter century ago, so it's good to see you continuing to do that good work. Grateful for both of you for your leadership around the world to make our efforts to fight terror finance more robust, more coordinated, more successful. This is information sharing and collecting. One thing in your testimony, Director Calvery, I was interested in your discussion about sharing, with other financial intelligence units around the world, and that makes complete sense to me, and sharing with other public entities in the U.S., like your work with Homeland Security and Border Security. Excellent work. But whenever I talk to people in the private sector, they seem always more interested in targeting rather than sharing. And so a question I have for you is, how can we focus on targeting rather than just funneling terabytes of information into Treasury's IT center and analytics center? It seems like we're missing the power of hundreds of people out there on the front lines every day in our biggest banks around the globe. So can you reflect on sharing essentially with the private sector's financial intelligence units in our biggest banks in the world, and also how we can better target getting them engaged on the front lines of terror finance?
Sure. I think there's been some real innovation in this space over the last year, which I referenced briefly earlier. both in the United States, the United Kingdom as well. There's been a fair amount in the press about the JMLT, the Joint Money Laundering Task Forces that they're operating. But both of us are doing essentially the same thing, and that is doing targeted information sharing between government and industry, financial institutions. So focusing on a very specific problem set. Maybe it's something related to ISIL, maybe it's something very targeted and specific, not the broad topic, and sharing targeted information, and then seeing what each side, what government can do, what industry can do, what industry can do by speaking to one another and sharing information, by putting all of our efforts together, what kind of progress can be made in targeting some of the financial facilitators that we're trying to go after. We're seeing promising results. Many of those efforts are still ongoing and in investigative stages, so I can't speak to the specifics, but I can tell you there's a lot of excitement on this topic right now. There's a lot of excitement in industry. This is what they would prefer to be doing, the people that staff their financial intelligence units, and it's what government and the law enforcement area, what they'd like to be doing. So I'm expecting that there's going to be great development in this area just because of the concentration of effort of some very talented people in the year ahead.
Thanks. On the subject of beneficial ownership, I congratulate Treasury for finding and plugging the gap in single-member, non-citizen-owned LLCs. I think that was a good proposal you've made to Congress and in your disclosure in the recent days. But I still have trouble, and we've had this discussion in a number of these hearings, understanding your push for bank collection of beneficial ownership at the 25% ownership level through the normal customer ID process, when instead, under the code section 6103, why don't we grant FinCEN the ability to get IRS data, which has much more up-to-date, much more accurate beneficial ownership for C Corps and LLCs, particularly if you plug the foreign single-member question. Why do we keep going back to something that's dated and not very reliable, frankly?
So I think that's an important question, and it's important to understand the distinction between government understanding beneficial ownership to help it with its investigations. So like the proposed legislation to collect information at the time of company formation, that would help law enforcement. It's important to distinguish that from a bank's responsibilities as well, to understand who their customers are and to be able to assess whether there's a suspicious activity occurring within those accounts. It's only a financial institution that's going to have insight into whether their customer is engaged in suspicious activity and file those reports that will get to law enforcement and potentially initiate an investigation. So for instance, if they know who the beneficial ownership is of a legal entity customer, they're going to be better positioned to implement their sanctions obligations. They're going to be in a better position to understand whether the activity is the type of activity they should expect from that customer.
Yeah. I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman, but I understand that. But the issue is they already have that obligation under the Bank Secrecy Act now on filing a SAR. They don't need more directive about documenting beneficial ownership when they gather that information a lot now, both on the deposit side and the loan side, including who's responsible for filing the tax return for the LLC, et cetera. Banks know that information, and they have an obligation if there's something suspicious to report it. I'm talking about the timeliness and accuracy of actual beneficial ownership that you want to try to sort through, and I'm arguing that the IRS has a much better source of that data that's much more current, much more accurate than secretaries of states or bank credit files. That's the argument I'm making, and that it's a much more robust source of that data if you had access to it as a law enforcement agency under something like 6103's normal power arrangements for IRS data.
So I think that seems to be more of a reference to the beneficial ownership legislation proposal. Yeah. And there, we're focused on having FinCEN collect the information or have the information because it's a part of our statutory mandate to make that information available to law enforcement, more broadly, state, federal law enforcement, to enable them to do their jobs, to provide it to regulatory authorities, and to provide it as appropriate to the intelligence community to fight international terrorism and other national security threats. Whereas in the tax context, there's much more limited abilities to be able to share that information with the broader community. And so that's the thinking, I think, behind
but that's
the
a problem I think you need to solve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your
Thank you.
extra time.
Sure. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses today for being here. Ms. Shasky, Calvery, especially for your service as well, Mr. McDonald. I want to focus on something because you hit on something in your opening statement, Mr. McDonald. You state the goal is a system in which both prevention and enforcement measures are robust and mutually reinforcing. It would seem to me that absent enforcement, you won't have prevention because one would lead to the deterrent of the other and hopefully be a good system. It reminds me of a commercial that I saw on TV for LifeLock where you have a bank guard standing in the middle of a robbery and one of the victims saying, do something, and the bank guard says, I'm just a monitoring guard. I don't do anything to prevent the actual robbery. My focus here is going to be on enforcement. Ms. Shasky, Calvery, are we doing enough in enforcement?
I think we are. The United States is doing more than any other country around the world in terms of enforcing the Bank Secrecy Act. If anything, the criticism internationally is that we're doing too much. But
are other countries cooperating with enforcement? In other words, are we just, we're gathering data, we're monitoring, we find specific targets, we find dynamic targets that require some of our developing countries to assist us. Do they enforce to the level that we need them to enforce in order to lead to prevention?
there's not one answer, because there's so many countries out there, I can't answer one way for all of them. Each is a different situation. But I think we are seeing a trend moving in a positive direction where more and more of our partners around the world are enforcing their anti-money laundering provisions. And now in FATF, there's been a move. Before it was enough just to have laws on the books criminalizing or otherwise prohibiting money laundering and terrorist finance. Now there's a move in when we do mutual evaluations, when we do assessments of other countries as peers, to say whether they're in compliance with the international anti-money laundering standards. Now we're looking at effectiveness. It's not enough just to have rules on the books. Are you actually implementing them, and are they effective?
And what can we do if they're not implementing them, if they're not?
Well, at least in the FATF context, there's a system to have kind of increasing sanctions on countries for failing to comply with those standards.
That's what I'd ask you, especially as you reflect on 20 years there. What would you suggest we need to do more in terms of what resources or tools would be necessary to strengthen enforcement? Not so much with us as a country, but with our allies in trying to stop the money laundering and the terrorism financing.
Well,
Do the sanctions work?
So two separate questions. The first one in terms of enforcement of our AML-CFT regime, what more do we need to do there? I think we need to give the push on effectiveness and FATF a chance to work. There's going to be some very important conversations that are going to come out of that. We're in the first round of those reviews right now, and already it's starting to highlight some issues for us to be focused on in the years ahead. In terms of the sanctions regime and whether that works, I really would have to refer you to my colleagues at OFAC who do that for a living every day.
Okay. Mr. McDonald, would you say that there are obstacles to cooperation that Congress should know about with some of our cooperating countries?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, would you say that there are obstacles to cooperation? And if so, what could we do to try to overcome those obstacles?
So certainly there are obstacles. I mean, I already mentioned and won't repeat the obstacle of there being extremely low capacity and just terribly rudimentary workspaces and technology in the countries where we work. Another obstacle is, as I sort of alluded to in my oral remarks, the inevitability that entrenched interests will manifest themselves at some point. When you get to the point where
can we provide them any
capacity-
incentives? Can we provide them any incentives to invest more on their end without having to appropriate more on our end?
Well, I mean, I think I'll piggyback on a couple of things that Jen referred to. I do think that there's evidence that the FATF procedures and the FATF monitoring process does, if you'll accept the expression, put the squeeze in a positive way on countries that are subject to that. An example is Cambodia. They were in the FATF ICRG review process, not doing well. They saw the writing on the wall. They asked us for technical assistance to help them build the capacity to do better. It took years, but they did emerge from that process. Of course, it'll be important for them to sustain it. Just getting out of the ditch is just the first step.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are examples. There's evidence that the FATF process is can be an effective way of focusing attention. It's the case in Panama, another country that we've been talking about.
Thank you, and I see my time's up. I yield back.
Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Ms. Calvery and Mr. McDonald, thank you for your testimony today. Thank you for your service. Thanks to the work of the Office of Technical Assistance and FinCEN, a very critical work in terms of coordinating the government's efforts to stop terror financing. Wanted to start with Treasury's monitoring of the implementation of the Iran nuclear deal, and specifically the data on any Iranian sanctions relief moving to terror proxies. I know, Ms. Calvery, you indicated that that FinCEN really is not doing a whole lot of that you would defer to the Office of Foreign Asset Control. But to either of you, has Treasury made a finding about whether any sanctions relief has found its way into the hands of terrorists?
I don't believe that there has been a finding one way or the other, but I'm not certain.
And from Office of Technical Assistance, same conclusion?
Yes, I do not know the answer.
What about with your colleagues with the OFAC? Any communications within Treasury from OFAC about their monitoring of the implementation of the agreement?
I'd have to defer to OFAC on that.
Well, the reason why I would ask, and this is kind of a fundamental question in terms of Congress's oversight of the agreement, Secretary Kerry, about 5 months ago in Switzerland at the World Economic Forum, acknowledged that sanctions relief will likely go to terrorists. That's our own Secretary of State defending the agreement, acknowledged that maybe one of the core weaknesses of the agreement that he negotiated was that some of the sanctions relief would end up in the hands of the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps or other terrorist proxies. And so it's troubling that Treasury, which is charged with the mission of monitoring terror financing, doesn't really have an answer to that basic and fundamental question. And by the way, the Secretary of State, in making that declaration, indicated that there would be consequences. There would be consequences if Iran uses the money to fund terrorism. Well, how can we know to impose consequences if we don't know whether or not any of the sanctions relief has in fact found its way into the hands of terrorists?
Congressman, I want to make sure that I didn't misspeak. I did not mean to suggest that Treasury does not have answers to these questions. Instead, as the Director of FinCEN, I don't have answers to those questions, but I'd be happy to take them back.
Thank you.
The same for me. It's just not in my area of responsibility, but I feel confident that there's an answer to that question in Treasury.
We'd like to know, and so thank you for, and I recognize that technical assistance and FinCEN are not at the core of that question, but presumably the Office of Foreign Assets Control would be someone at Treasury. I mean, this is a pretty critical question that Treasury should be well aware of, everyone within Treasury in the area of countering terror finance. Let me quickly move on to the Office of Technical Assistance specifically. And Mr. McDonald, in your testimony, you indicated that OTA has a relatively smaller footprint in the Middle East.
given that the locus of most terrorist activity is in the Middle East, shouldn't we be more, and I understand that you have to have a willing government as a partner here, but shouldn't we be more proactively and aggressively interjecting ourselves into those Middle Eastern embassies?
So when I made my remarks about the importance of demand-driven technical assistance, I did not mean to suggest that we should be sitting back on our heels and waiting for others to come to us and not doing anything on our own. So certainly part of my job is to make sure that potential partners for our technical assistance program are aware of our program, of how it relates to U.S. national interests and their interests. And I would also say that an important part of the role of Treasury's attaches overseas is to serve as advocates for this kind of awareness. So certainly that's part
just in
of it.
terms of prioritization of the scarce resources that Treasury has in this area. Maybe it is too scarce, but do we have enough attaches in our Middle Eastern embassies?
So I asked this question before I came up today. You know, what's the answer if the question is, are there enough attaches out there? And certainly we would welcome and benefit from additional resources, not only to support additional attaches, but even the ones that we have. So the rising cost of doing business at embassies internationally, which is affecting all agencies, not just Treasury, is one of concern just for our existing footprint. And in order to do more, certainly additional Treasury attaches would be helpful. I'm very aware of the benefit that I get out of our attaches in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in many, many countries. Well, not that many, actually 17 countries where we have attaches. But certainly that would be a helpful addition to the picture.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, is recognized.
Yeah, I thank the chairman and ranking member. And I also want to thank our witnesses today. I represent Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is home to probably the most Somali Americans in our country, in North America. Perhaps we have as many Somali Americans in the Minneapolis area as they do in anywhere outside of Somalia. And I can tell you, and I think you are well aware, that there is a crisis going on, and it's not getting better. Many U.S.-based Americans who find their roots in that part of the world are unable to provide critical assistance to their loved ones. Some of this is food, some of this is school fees, a lot of it is just the basic sustenance of life. Upwards of 40% of the GDP of Somalia is foreign remittance. Now, licensed money remitters, as you know, are known as money service businesses, or MSBs, and I'm sure you all are aware that they're losing their ability to open bank accounts and send money overseas. Increasingly, correspondent banks are declining to provide wire transfers to many nations, including Somalia, and many who have opened up these accounts are having them closed, and every day it feels like the window is a little smaller and smaller, you know. And I can tell you, I've talked to these banks and these credit unions, and they don't have a problem remitting money. But they feel that the financial and liability risk are so great to them that it just doesn't cost out for them. So they're making a business decision to close accounts and to not open them. In November 2014, FinCEN published a statement on providing banking services to money services businesses. I found this statement very clear, but since then, the situation really hasn't improved very much. And I guess my first question is, why did FinCEN's 2014 statement not really turn the trick? You know, why didn't it provide necessary assurance to bankers that they can meet their requirements and still provide services to regulatory compliant MSBs?
Ultimately, the banking industry has to assess the risks, what controls it can put in place, and what its appetite is to deal with those risks. And I think, as Larry can tell you from the work that he and his team do in Somalia, that Somalia presents a lot of challenges around the illicit finance risks present in the country and the state of its financial system and its ability to control those risks. Here in the United States, what FinCEN is able to do and what we have been doing beyond issuing the statement in 2014 is to move on the Money Remittances Improvement Act that you proposed and President Obama signed into law in 2014 to ensure that there is good supervision of the money services business industry and that banks and banking regulators, examiners, know that that supervision system is strong, so that we have the conditions on this side to ensure that banks can have comfort that MSBs operating in the United States and how they're examined and supervised in the United States is something they can be comfortable with. That doesn't necessarily help them with the risks on the side in Somalia.
Okay. Would you like to respond, Mr. McDonald?
Only to mention that our technical assistance program is working with the Somali authorities, in particular in the area that Jen mentioned, to strengthen bank supervision capacity in the central bank. We are fortunate to have the collaboration of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya and the Kenyan School of Monetary Studies, where we conduct those training activities because the security environment doesn't allow us to do so in Somalia. So it is a tough undertaking, but it's one that we're committed to.
Well, I want to thank you for doing what you're doing, and I just want to encourage you to do more, because if our effort is to thwart and stop the terrorists and Al-Shabaab, if we drive the money underground, it's just more opaque. It's not a better situation. Let me see if I can squeeze one more question in. I've heard from banks that their regulators do not acknowledge that MSBs are regulated by state banking supervisors and the IRS. So banks feel that they must not only know their customer, but their customer's customer. Do you see this phenomenon? Is there a way we can get through this? How do you see this?
So that's the effort that we've been particularly focused on, I would say, over the last 6 months. And I do see improvements, and that is the communication between money services businesses, their trade associations, their regulators, the states themselves, IRS, communicating to banks and their supervisors about how that supervision regime works. I think there was a fair amount of surprise amongst some of the banks and banking supervisors to see how much they are actually supervised. And we're also working with money services businesses on putting together a best practices guide for them so that they can give even further comfort.
Let me tell you, I'm about 40 seconds past my time. But maybe if there's another round, I have a few more questions for you. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from Delaware, Mr. Carney, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for chairing this hearing today and for your very good work on this task force. Thank you to both of you for coming in and for your work for our country. I'm not a member of the task force, so I appreciate an opportunity to be here and to listen to the testimony and to ask a few questions. And I'll try to end with just a general question, which is if the both of you could kind of underscore, after this full discussion, the top 3 threats that keep you up at night in this area.
We were going to flip a coin to see who went first, but certainly Iraq is a country, an area of concern. It's part of a broader region of concern. I am hopeful that our technical assistance engagement there, as part of a broader, significantly broader set of steps on the security front, will be beneficial and be fruitful. So Iraq is a country of concern.
So getting better or worse?
Pardon me?
Getting better or worse?
I think we are having to postpone our scheduled next mission, because of the recent unrest in the international zone. So that's not better. Afghanistan, a country that I visited many times, where we have resumed a technical assistance engagement, very important part of the world. That keeps me up at night in some respects. I have a feeling, a sense of hope that the current leadership, President Ghani, who I know well from when he was the finance minister of Afghanistan, understands the issues, understands the importance of building institutional capacity, but he's obviously got a tremendous number of security, political, and other challenges that he's confronting.
I'm running out of time. Number 3.
So I'll stop. Why don't I just
Anything else that you'd like to add to that? And I have one other point I'd like to make.
I'll go quickly. So number 1 would be the idea that ensuring that we collect and share any information we possibly can to prevent a foreign terrorist fighter or homegrown violent extremist from engaging in violent activity in this country. Number 2, that we're doing everything within our power at FinCEN to protect the financial system from cyber actors, illicit cyber actors. And number 3, that we, at the same time, stay focused on professional money laundering networks that are responsible for laundering billions of dollars for organized crime and other illicit actors.
So it doesn't sound like you guys sleep very well at night with those concerns. So I'm disappointed that Mr. Hill's not here, because I'd like to follow up on the last point that he made. I represent the state of Delaware. Most corporations, LLCs, are formed in Delaware, and the concerns raised about beneficial ownership concern elected officials and leaders in Delaware as well as elsewhere. Mr. Hill talked about, and Senator Carper on the other side of the Capitol is working on legislation that would give access to the to law enforcement agencies to the data that's already being collected at IRS, and to expand on some of that data so that law enforcement had better tools around beneficial ownership to kind of get beyond the so-called corporate veil. Do you have a view of that? You had a back and forth, but I wasn't clear on what your view was on using that IRS data and making it available to law enforcement agencies.
Yes, so Treasury and the administration set up a proposal just a few weeks ago on a legislative proposal on the collection of beneficial ownership information that we think is the right solution. We're definitely open to continuing the conversation to come to a solution on this issue, but that proposal would focus on FinCEN collecting information. One of the benefits to that proposal over some of the others I've seen over the years that would have put the onus on the states to collect information and make it available is that it doesn't require states to do anything extra. It also has a 50-state solution, so to speak, in the sense that you can't have arbitrage between different states if they do things differently. But that's the proposal that we've been pushing.
Thank you very much again to the chair and ranking member. Thanks very much for the opportunity to sit in.
With that, we're going to proceed to a second round of questions. There shouldn't be too many. I just actually have I want to recognize myself first for 5 minutes. One particular issue, it has to do with asset forfeiture. So my question would be to you, Mr. McDonald. Recently, there was a series of meetings in South and Central America that Representative Pittenger and Representative Ellison and I attended with a number of others. And as we traveled and met with different governmental and FIU professionals in those countries, there was an area of common concern. I think we take for granted sometimes that in this country, most states have asset forfeiture laws in place. And so you find a bad actor, a lawbreaker, you can not only, after prosecution, take their liberty, but you can hurt them a second time by getting to their assets. Most of the times, those assets were had with ill-begotten gains. If you can convert them to cash, you can, using our laws, take that cash and pay things like police overtime on the local level or the state level or federal to investigate the next lawbreaker. So one of the things we noticed specifically we're in Paraguay, and I'll just give you an example. Plane landed on a tarmac in Ciudad del Este near the tri-border area, and there was a somewhat legendary jet that was sitting there, had been, I guess, forfeited. And it looked like it had been there for about 10 years or so. It was covered with moss. And so we questioned, and the answer was we don't really have the process or the ability, technical assistance, I guess, to actually complete the forfeiture process. So what was a valuable asset at one point in time was just wasting away. It's probably going to cost the government funds and resources to get rid of it, as opposed to actually using it against the terrorists or the money launderers or the narco traffickers or wherever it came from. So does OTA, what can you tell us about some of these countries that we work with and their ability to use asset forfeiture and our assistance to help them get their job done?
So first, we do provide technical assistance to help countries establish and implement asset forfeiture regimes. You are right that it is an unattended area or a non-existent area in a number of countries. It is one of the important areas of the work of our economic crimes team. It is something that I think if we had been there when the plane first got to that tarmac and became, possibly available for being part of an asset forfeiture action, it would have been a good thing. But we are working with, I'm going to confirm this, but part of our work in Paraguay is, I believe, on asset forfeiture. It is certainly part of our work in other countries in Central America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. In Haiti, frankly, one of our, and it's not, unfortunately, it's not a long list, but one of the examples of progress that we made in our engagement in Haiti was on asset forfeiture. So bottom line, you're absolutely right. That's an important part of the AML-CFT regime strengthening effort. It is something that we do. So in a demonstration of OTA efficiency, the head of OTA's enforcement economic crimes team, Aaron Sheng, just reminded me that we began an asset forfeiture management work in Paraguay. There was a mission, a TDY, earlier this month, and it's an area of high demand. I don't think that I've actually seen that plane, and I don't think that we're going to get much money out of that plane, but we're going to fix the asset forfeiture regime so that that sort of thing is not repeated.
There won't be much money out of that plane at this point in time. It's been sitting there, it appears as though a long time, a decade or more. But if it's just an example where sometimes you have to invest money to get money back,
Yep.
If you want to suggest some additional resources OTA could use, I would like to see funds properly invested in providing technical assistance in some of these countries so they can get more of their own resources and we can do a better job together. But yeah, I appreciate the fact that you guys are on top of that particular case, which, as I said, was somewhat legendary there. We spoke to the prosecutor about it, and we couldn't really get a coherent answer.
If I may just quickly to note that in addition to technical assistance in the asset forfeiture area, a big part of our work across other teams is domestic resource mobilization more generally. So trying to help these countries mobilize more resources in their own country to the benefit of efforts to combat money laundering and terrorist financing, but also so that they can provide basic public services more effectively than they're able to do now.
Recognize Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just follow up. We had a situation here several months ago where we had cyber hackers get into the central bank in Bangladesh and sent instructions to the New York Federal Reserve Bank to wire. Actually, they requested $951 million to be sent to various locations around the globe. They ended up successfully getting the New York Fed to wire $81 million to some casinos in the Philippines, and they successfully stole the $81 million. There was a payout I know we have Abu Sayyaf operating there out on the smaller islands in the Philippines. Is there any indication that, I mean, this is a pretty sophisticated operation, and I know that the Philippine government has issued, or taken away people's passports because they think it was an inside job. I'm not so sure it was, you know, but are you folks involved in that, and what can you tell us about it?
I can't say a whole lot in this forum because there are ongoing investigations and so forth happening. What I can tell you is, at the highest level, the threat of malicious cyber actors is a top priority of the U.S. government. The idea that they're going to attack our financial institutions or financial infrastructure is a top priority of the Treasury, and there's many people at Treasury who are working on this issue every day. At FinCEN specifically, our role is to collect information through suspicious activity reports, and we do get a lot of information in those SARs on different cyber threats.
There's a little wrinkle here because the Philippine Senate had a bill to require reporting of suspicious transactions, the suspicious activity reports, and the casinos lobbied against them in the Philippine legislature and defeated the amendment, so they don't have that. So we've got this gap in the Philippine anti-money laundering protocols, and here we are in the meantime basically signing a trade agreement with these folks, and so it's problematic. But you know, are there other measures that we've got this vulnerability in the Philippines because of the lack of this anti-money laundering legislation. Are there other ways that we can fill that gap to help you do your job?
Well, one of the things that we're currently doing to fill that gap is at FinCEN, we have a program known as the Global Rapid Response Program. We work it together with the FBI, Secret Service, and I believe Homeland Security just signed on. And what we've been doing is when there are cyber incidents like this and the money moves, it moves very quickly, and of course it's moving internationally, law enforcement gets information from the victim, usually a big business, and they get that information to us. We work with our partner FIUs around the world to get that money either refused, turned around, or arrested before the bad guy actually gets his hands on it. In the last 18 months, I believe we've recovered around $186 million on behalf of U.S. businesses, and it's a program that unfortunately I think is going to keep increasing.
Mr. McDonald, anything to add?
No, not on this topic.
Okay. This was all done via SWIFT, which is a huge problem for us. You mentioned the recovery that we've had on behalf of U.S. businesses. Was that with international partners where SWIFT would be involved, or are those internal within the U.S. where SWIFT would not be involved?
It was with international partners where wire transfers would have gone, internationally.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Recognize the Vice Chairman, Mr. Pittenger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sometime back, we had a briefing with the 4 major banks who came to discuss their role in our combined efforts. And in that discussion, of course, these 4 banks receive 90% of the foreign funds that come into our country. And they shared with us the problems that they have under 314B in sharing information with each other, but also in 314 in receiving information from the government. And one thought that came out at that time was establishing some type of nonprofit who could be in receipt of data. I'm aware that in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, the government, and the financial institutions have joined together, and there's a 501c3 that's been established. Do you envision something like that? Pardon? For cyber. Yeah, for cyber. That's for cyber war.
Sure.
Cyber crimes. Do you envision something like that that could be established?
So I am familiar with the outfit in Pittsburgh, and have certainly been involved in many of these discussions with our big four financial institutions, as we and others have been exploring ideas of how best to share information and what we might want to try to set up. I think the thinking, we'll see, but my sense is that the thinking has evolved a bit away from this idea of establishing a nonprofit, as some of these institutions are trying out different mechanisms for sharing information with one another under 314B and 314A. They're kind of learning by doing in terms of what are going to be the most effective ways to share information, and we at FinCEN are supporting them. We've had a number of meetings and discussions about it, and have been very open to issuing guidance or administrative rulings on any questions that industry might have.
Well, clearly we need to modify 314 in terms of the safe harbor rules, but because they feel the impediments there in terms of receiving data from the government that they feel like is important for them. Regarding FATF, do you envision that TTUs could be or should be incorporated as the recommendations with FATF?
Wow. I haven't been privy to much of this discussion of whether TTUs are going to be incorporated into FATF, so I just don't know the answer to that question.
The thought, I mean, from your experience of 20 years, do you feel like that is a valid option that we should be looking at?
I think it's worth continuing to explore information sharing in all its forms. So I do know that FATF is very focused on that. They're interested not just in how our FIUs sharing information with one another, but how also is law enforcement doing that, and I would put it under that kind of rubric. So I wouldn't be surprised with some of the efforts that they have ongoing to look at that issue, whether TTU isn't a part of it or whether it couldn't be a part of it.
Ms. Shasky, Calvery, how many members are there in Egmont?
I believe it's 151.
151. And Ms. McDonald, the OTAs, how many countries do we serve or work with?
In the economic crimes area, we work in 15 countries.
15 countries?
15, 1-5, yeah.
1-5. What would you say would be the ideal number? If you could, to get a complete, the best communication, establish relationships, the best collaboration, the best impact, what number would you like to see our working relationship with in terms of countries?
So we did an exercise along these lines internally once, and we kind of like thought, setting aside all financial considerations, what would be our dream
yes, sir, that's what I want to hear.
Dream footprint for the whole program. And I will, you know, we're in about, overall, we're in about 50 countries for the whole program, 15 in the economic crimes area. We resist, ultimately, we did not come down to a specific number. And the reason is, it really doesn't matter if you are not in a country that is determined to use your assistance well. And you just, it's very difficult to know that ahead of time. We do our best to do good assessments. I would say, look, if I had to pull a number out of my back pocket here, we certainly see an increasing number of demands, requests for our technical assistance on AML-CFT matters, whether it's because Central American or other countries know that criminality in their own countries is a great threat to them, and so they want to do more to reduce the financing for that, or because they see banks picking up and decamping. So we have their attention. I do.
Excuse me. How many cooperating countries would you say that there are out there? I mean, you've stated that clearly that there are those who would be difficult and challenged to work with, but what's the universe of those who you believe would be willing to cooperate with us?
Oh, I could easily see us working with 20 to 25 countries in the AML-CFT area, but that's based on what we know now about emerging needs.
What is the distinction? Please clarify for me, Ms. Shasky, Calvery, and Ms. McDonald. The 150 members, FIUs, members of Egmont, and the more limited numbers of countries that are engaged with us with OTA?
Well, Egmont includes member countries from the entire globe.
I understand.
We are authorized by statute to work in developing countries and transitional countries. The transitional country term goes back to when we were created, former Soviet Union and so on, transitioning. So we are only a subset of the total membership potential of Egmont.
We got that. Would you say that your major impediment then is financing?
It's so tempting
Is
to
it
say.
resources on your part? Is it talented people who that we could send in to be attaches?
We would definitely benefit from additional resources in terms of financing to support our technical advisory work, in terms of attaché presence. But I would also, so the answer to that is yes. That is an impediment that we would benefit from more resources, but we have to be judicious in how we use those resources and to focus it on those countries where we think we're going to be able to get something done.
You mentioned one cooperative country that they had a computer and a chair in a room. I mean, that was their limitation.
Yeah.
How do we support them financially? What are the entities that would participate? Is it us, our State Department, the World Bank, IMF?
So in a place like Liberia, where there's pretty much everything to be done, we would focus our efforts on just getting the financial intelligence unit functioning in a basic way. We would reach out to the World Bank, possibly USAID, to see if they could finance the acquisition of basic information technology. I mean basic stuff that would allow banks to report suspicious transactions electronically rather than on written pieces of paper. We might reach out to other bilateral providers. The UK is active in this area. To see if they could complement our work. So we would, in a country like Liberia, where there's everything to be done, we would be reaching out to a number of different parties.
Thank you. I appreciate both of you. Ms. Shasky, Calvery, you in the private sector, look forward to continued dialogue. And Mr. McDonald, in your position now, I look forward to more dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you much.
I'd like to thank our witnesses again for their time and their testimony to the task force here today. Without objection, all members will have 5 additional legislative days within which to submit written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses. And I'd ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you're able. With that, task force is adjourned.
Nice job, Mr. Chairman.